introduce them. First, there would be Professor Hilal Khashan to speak on the emerging security dynamic in West Asia. He has written in a prolific manner on a number of subjects pertaining to the region and is presently the head of the Political Studies and Public Administration Department at the American University of Beirut. I'd like to request now Professor Khashan to make his presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like first to thank the Director General of IDSA, Mr. N.S. Sodia, for holding this excellent conference, and his staff for being superior at communication skills. Please, I would like to recognize two aspects of the security threat in West Asia, or the Middle East, as some would like to call it. In my paper, I chose to write on Iran and Sunni militant groups as sources of evolving security issues in the region. I would like to specify that both Iran and the Sunni militant groups see themselves as victims of security threats emerging from the outside of the region and also from certain regional actors associated with the West. As for Iran as a security threat actually has been seeing itself in the midst of a security issue ever since 1501, when the Safavid dynasty came into being. From the beginning, the Persians developed what became known as an existential crisis. And this existential crisis has survived until this very day. The Islamic Republic of Iran sees itself locked with the USA in an existential problem. The Ayatollahs in Iran realize the discrepancy in the power relationship between themselves and the US, and therefore have decided to play a battle with the US in a way that does not lead to a direct confrontation. And that Iranian style of dealing with their existential problem has led to what became known as Iran's security issue. The other dimension of my paper has to do with the Sunni militant groups. If you notice, I excluded Shiite militant groups, specifically Hezbollah, because I see them as part, I see Hezbollah as part of Iran, which is a state actor, as opposed to Sunni militant groups, which are non-state actors. There is one major discrepancy between Iran as a source of security threat in the region and the Sunni militant groups. In Iran, the religion and the state have complemented each other to create a sense of Iranian nationalism that one cannot separate. In the case of Sunni Islam, Islam has exited itself from the state into society. That's why Sunni Islamic movements have found themselves in a struggle, in a life or death struggle with the state, which they have not been able to defeat. The roots of the Sunni militant the roots of Sunni militant threat go back to the aftermath of the Six-Day War. That Six-Day War in 1967 showed the extent of the weakness of the Arab political order, and when the Arab armies were defeated in the battle with the Israelis, they found it difficult to continue to hold their hold on society. In a way, even those Arab regimes that previously had combated militant groups found themselves compelled to create their own non-conventional paramilitary groups to fight against the Israelis. And that explains why, in part, they were tolerant of militant groups such as in the beginning Palestinian groups, Fatah and other groups, because they felt that they were not in a position to deal with the Israelis, so they preferred to leave the stage for non-state actors. What happened in the Arab world was that the Six-Day War showed the defeat of the Arab state order, but that defeat had its roots. The roots go to the very days of the formation of the Middle Eastern state system. That state system, and then the rise of the so-called nation state in the Middle East, which remained, with the exception of Iran and Egypt, rather nebulous, gave rise to a form of state that in the 1950s and 60s witnessed the emergence of army officers who wanted to reshape society into their own liking. Once they did that, and along with their emphasis on secularism, they found themselves combating a fundamentally religious society. They created a new political structure. They announced new political aims and aimed at modernization, and in the process, they defeated society's traditional patterns of conflict resolution and societal interaction and development. The defeat of the traditional patterns of communication and conflict resolution, and the rise of secular modes that remained alien to society and eventually proved themselves to be a failure, played a decisive role in the rise of the militant Islamic groups, which found in the Arab army's defeat in 1967 an outlet for themselves to exact a change in society. Those Islamic groups wavered first between Arab nationalism, which was defeated in the mid-60s, and then the rise of the concept of territorial state. And with the failure of the concept of territorial state, those Islamic groups saw themselves as the agents of mobilization in society and also the agents of change. Their problem, as was referred to this morning in Mr. Warden's presentation, was the lack of strategy. These movements were visionary. They had a vision. They wanted to change society, but they never had a plan of action. They never thought that they were able themselves to transform society and defeat the existing political order. They hoped that by instigating violence and campaigning against the state and attacking its machinery of coercion and its establishments, they could create a mass movement in society that would lead to a revolution and that would alter the existing political system. That did not happen. Eventually, the state was able to defeat the militant groups. Everywhere the state in the Arab East had to deal with the militant group, the state prevailed. There is no single instance on record where a militant group in West Asia was able to deliver a defeat or exact a defeat to the machinery of the state. The Brotherhood in Egypt learned that in the 1950s. And then they eventually decided to transform themselves into a pacifist organization and aim at transforming society at the level of the grassroots. In Syria, the Islamic Brotherhood was massively defeated by the state by 1982. Even in Lebanon, Lebanon as divided as it is and as fragmented as it is, and being marred by religion, whereby the state has preferred to play a low key in dealing with sectarian issues. When the state had to confront the Fatah al-Islam movement in the summer of 2007, they dealt them a lethal blow that resulted in the destruction of the Nahr al-Barid camp. So if a weak state such as Lebanon could deal a lethal blow to a fundamentalist group, other states in the region were even more successful. In Saudi Arabia, the Islamic movement was soundly defeated by the end of 2003. The Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was defeated. Even though after 2003 they tried to establish a comeback and launch few attacks that only made the news for a day or so, but by and large, the movement has proven itself to be a total defeat. And eventually, the Saudis, who were bent on dealing with their political system, chose to find other outlets for the expression of their wrath at the political system. And that has contributed, to a sense, to the formation of the so-called national militant group in the region. By the way, Islamic militancy in the region remains by and large a nationalist movement, a domestic movement, even though it may have certain transnational underpinnings, but it is fundamentally national, and it sees the national leaders as its main enemies, in a sharp contrast with the militant group of the Brotherhood in Egypt in 1928, which was universalist in its orientation. The Islamic movement that emerged in Egypt in the early 1970s and elsewhere in the Arab East were mainly national, who saw the state as their own national state as the primary source of threat, and they were determined to bring him down. Turning back to Iran, in Iran, as you see, is a state actor. Iran has been able to play its so-called existential problem rather well. The Iranians seem to quite well understand the rules of the international game and have been playing it rather successfully. The roots of this problem go to the initial days of the Safavid Empire, their fights with the Ottomans, and then Russian incursion at the Iranian state. And later on in the 19th century, the Iranians found themselves dealing the British, whom they could not stop. And the Iranians tell us about numerous acts of violations of their country, which they were unable to deal with, such as the tobacco concession and the Darcy concession in the beginning of the 20th century, and then the failed constitutional movement in 1906, and later American intervention in Iran that led to the reinstallation of the Shah after, and that put an end to the to Mossadegh's term in Iran. So with the Shah arriving to power, he soon realized that his country needs to deal with its adversaries, and he looked to the north and he saw the Soviet Union as his main enemy, and he decided from the beginning, as early as 1957, on developing for his country a nuclear potential. And he struck with the Eisenhower administration a deal in 1957 that called for providing Tehran University with a small nuclear reactor, 5 megawatt reactor. By 1974, the Shah was determined to transform his country into a nuclear power, mainly for the use of the nuclear power in industry generation. He knew that the U.S. would not allow him to develop a nuclear weapon, but he believed that the U.S. was in favor. Actually, the Americans were enthusiastic in providing him with the help he needed in order to develop a nuclear capability. And it's ironic that today the U.S. administration, until very recently the Bush administration, many of its members were present in the Ford administration, and at that time they favored giving Iran a full nuclear cycle. The same people who were in favor of transforming Iran into a nuclear capable power were determined to prevent the Iran and after the revolution from going through the same path. So, but the Iranians were determined to do it nevertheless. As soon as the revolution was successful in 1979, the Ayatollahs, who looked with disdain at military power and saw no need for military expenditure, and they put the arms they got from the U.S. to disuse, and they even disbanded the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization, and decided even to cut down on their oil consumption and production, and opted for the policy of no East, no West. Within few months after the revolution, the Iraqis attacked. The first 3-4 years of the war shocked the Ayatollahs in Iran and made them revisit their policy of armament, and they decided to reactivate their nuclear program and build an arsenal of conventional firepower. Now, in their quest for security, the Iranians decided to launch a security-guided foreign policy. In their security-guided foreign policy, the Iranians decided on locating for themselves spheres of regional influence. And this explains that immediately after the triumph of the revolution, the Ayatollah Khomeini called on the Iraqis to bring down the regime of Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athist regime and create an Islamic republic. But the only success the Iranians were able to find at the time was in religiously divided Lebanon. And in 1982, they created Hezbollah. So for years, this has been the Iranian policy, to defend that system, to defend the Iranian revolution by locating allies outside and break their sense of stranglehood. Iran feels that it is surrounded by enemies, and they need to exit their sense of encirclement by locating friends abroad. That's why they support Hezbollah. By supporting Hezbollah and Hamas, Iran became a party to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And this also explains their support for Shia groups in the Persian Gulf, especially in Bahrain and Kuwait. Okay. Now, as for Iran's nuclear program, the Iranians genuinely feel that what lies at stake is not their nuclear program, because they don't say that there's anything they want to do that the Shah did not do. They feel that the real problem is not their nuclear program, but rather their request for influence. The Iranians feel that they're entitled to become a regional power, to have a say in the Gulf and elsewhere in the region. And they say that their quest for influence in the region is the crux of the problem. And they say all they want is recognition. At heart, the Iranians say that they have no problem with U.S. vital interests in the region. All they want is that the Americans accept their own interests in the region, which do not seem, in their own view, to clash with those of the U.S. or the West in general. The Iranians argue that their history, their achievements, their culture, and their preeminence in the Gulf warrant that they become a regional power. And the Iranians argue that Iran is a pragmatic country, and they argue that pragmatism, the exigencies of the Iranian state, and are far more important than Iranian sense of religion or Ayatollah Khomeini's conception of the virtuous republic. In the early years of the republic, the Iranians had no difficulty at all collaborating with the Israelis against the Iraqis. And in the mid-1980s, in exchange for hostages in Lebanon, the U.S. administration provided Iran with military equipment. So the Iranians see no problem, and they have no reservations in dealing with the West. All they want to do is U.S. recognition of their importance, and they point to the failure of the U.S. administration in trying to contain Iran. Iranian scholars argue that the European Union's policy of approach of soft policy works much better than American heavy-handed policy of coercion and defeating their enemy. Thank you.